Hey, welcome back. Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about identity and access management and single sign-on and things like that as part of our continuation of cybersecurity awareness quarter, because now we're in December. I hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving holiday and all that stuff. But let's kind of dive into it. So, identity and access management and things like that have been in the news quite a bit lately. Okta, one of the larger providers, was recently involved in a breach. And just I think today or yesterday, they announced that it was significantly broader than they originally anticipated. So I think early on, they were saying some small percentage, maybe less than a percent of client data was sort of impacted. But it was sensitive data, so that was a problematic thing. Um, Today they I think revised that to say that it was a all of their customer data, but a less severe scope. So things like maybe contact information and things like that. But obviously that breach is still being investigated, so there may be more news in the future. Unfortunately, they were also part of the news related to things like the MGM breach because they were the provider there. Um, but they're one of several identity and access management providers, including Microsoft themselves. So it's not strictly an Okta issue, but I wanted to talk about the subject as a whole because obviously this is a interesting topic, and from a security standpoint, lots of pros and cons. So let's talk a little bit about at a high level what IAM is, or identity and access management. Conceptually, IAM is the evolution of what used to just be called single sign on. And at a high level, the idea is basically that me as a person needs access to lots of things, especially now as businesses migrate more towards cloud platforms and things like that. We enter this situation where data is decentralized. Um, and that sucks, right? Like from a user's perspective, having to memorize dozens and dozens of usernames and passwords puts us in this very awkward position. So IAM sets out to resolve that by making it so a single user identity can be used across lots of different platforms to gain them the access they need when they need it. And from an administration perspective, you're not forcing the user to memorize, a dozen different passwords for a dozen different tools. And it kind of looks like this, right? We have a user, they have a single identity, it goes out to a bunch of different apps, and those apps all then talk back to the identity provider where that identity is managed. So in the case of something like Okta would be the IAM provider, or Microsoft could be an IAM provider, or any other number of providers out there. But this is like at a high level the gist of it. There's thousands and thousands of applications that can integrate with these providers, which is why it becomes helpful, right? Whether you're logging in to check your email, logging into Salesforce, logging into some other, um, you know, a line of business application that you require access to, you're only having to log in with your identity, and it then can speak to the provider, and that aligns with things like security groups, with everything else that you need, so all your permissions can stay synced up, and your company as a whole can manage it in a central location instead of having an administrative team go to all these individual tools when you onboard a new employee or offboard somebody. So why I am right? Simplified user experience is the primary objective here. It's to make everybody's lives easier from a user perspective. They only have to remember one username and password, much less prone to getting compromised if they can remember one strong password instead of having to, write down a dozen to remember them. Or you kind of force users to either start repeating things, or simplifying them if they're going to remember all of them, or writing them down in places, and that's what we don't want. We don't want any of that stuff. We want very strong passphrases, but you have to find a balance there to make that happen. um More consistent security application is also really important, right? If you have a system administrators who are forced to manage 100 different applications, or even 10 different applications, inevitably they're going to make a mistake if they're manually applying rules and policies and security implementations. So the fewer things they have to click on any given new user setup, the less likely they are to make mistakes. So IAM kind of addresses that by centralizing those setups. You create it in one place, all those other tools know where to look for that information, and you're kind of good to go. And simplified administration, right? If a user locks themselves out, it's much easier to reset an account in one place and try to figure out which portal you have to log into, how you have to reset the account, and all those kinds of things. And if employees exit the company, it's obviously easier to turn down a single account from one IAM provider than go to 10 or 12 different portals and turn off their accounts there individually. So there's a lot of benefits to it, which is why it's becoming more and more popular as we kind of go through this decentralization of our data. Now, obviously, with anything, there's going to be risks. The main ones are things like single point of failure, right? If your IAM provider goes down, now all your tools have you locked out. That's kind of a bummer. It's true, potentially. So you have to kind of look at that kind of stuff. But one of the bigger ones that we're seeing right now is that centralized target where all your data is. That provider becomes a very, very, very um, valuable target to an attacker. And we're starting to see more and more of that, right? When we look at supply chain attacks, when we look at provider attacks like this, we see these big groups like Alpha going after these providers now. They're not going after the individual company, they're going after this centralized provider who they can then use to get into all these other environments. It's a new kind of supply chain attack where they're not necessarily poisoning some update or using them to get into your network, but they're using the actual service they provide you, identity management, to get into your network if they can compromise it. And that's a pretty big risk. Vendor lock-in is another one that I've seen a lot, so I throw it in there. But it's basically where you become so dependent on one vendor that moving away is pretty hard. Um, I don't like getting myself locked into vendors to the point where I can't be agile as a business, right? Like I obviously have a lot invested in tooling that we use, but I like to keep myself a little bit able to protect myself in case of large price increases or compromises like this, right? Like you never want to be in a position where your business is at risk and you can't separate yourself reasonably. So vendor lock-in is kind of a problem. Now, and that's kind of the gist, right? Like that's sort of the idea behind IAM is it has the benefits of having a single sign-on location. It has the benefits of simplified management, but ultimately you have to decide if that's worth the risk of something like centralized targets for attacking. We have the same discussions around things like password managers, which is one of the alternatives to IAM, right? If you're going to have people logging into lots of different portals, giving them a password manager is a good idea. That way they can put a secure password somewhere. But ultimately, that means the password manager could become a target. And we've seen breaches with password management tools recently. I don't think any have breached their actual user vaults yet, but we've seen things very close to that. We've seen things with plugins. We've seen actual breaches with development code, things like that. So we're not we're bound to see a breach of a password sharing tool eventually. I think it's just kind of a matter of time. But for now, you only have a few choices. You can either go with an IAM provider, someone like Okta, like Microsoft, and centralize that login information, which is handy because at least you can monitor and control it at that point. You can go with things like a password management solution where everybody has distributed accounts, but they have to be able to manage them somehow. I think that's a lot harder. You lose a lot more control that way, but you don't have that single, or you have less of a single point of failure at that point. The password manager is now a single point of failure, but still, or you just leave it up to people to manage their own passwords and hope they don't replicate them in different systems and hope they don't jot them down on post-its that they leave on their desks and hope they don't keep them super simple so they remember, right? Um, and that's kind of the challenge of IAM, but that's what it is. If you were curious, appreciate everybody who tuned in tonight. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out and have a great night.